August 15, 1944. The dust clouds kicked up by military transport trucks hung in the humid Louisiana air as the convoy carrying 47 German women prisoners of war approached Camp Ruston through the pine forests of Lincoln Parish. These were not frontline combatants, but the specialized personnel who had kept the Luftwaffe's radar and communications networks functioning until the Wehrmacht's collapse in France. Radio operators, telephone switchboard supervisors, aircraft tracking specialists, and cipher clerks, women whose technical skills had made them valuable enough to evacuate ahead of advancing Allied forces, only to be captured during the chaotic retreat through Normandy. Oberstfried Elizabeth Hoffman pressed her face against the canvas covering of the truck bed, straining to see their destination through the small gap between the fabric and the tailgate. At 24, she had operated radio equipment at Luftwaffe bases across occupied Europe, from Norway to Greece, watching the gradual deterioration of German air power as fuel shortages and Allied bombing took their toll. Her last assignment had been at a radar station near Cannes, where she had tracked incoming Allied aircraft until the station was overrun by Canadian forces on July 18. The 3-week journey to this moment had been a systematic destruction of everything Nazi propaganda had taught her about American military capabilities and character. The initial processing at Allied camps near the Normandy beaches had been conducted with efficiency that exceeded anything she had witnessed in the German military bureaucracy. Identity photographs, medical examinations, Geneva Convention rights explanations delivered in fluent German by American officers who had clearly been trained specifically for prisoner processing. But the real shock had come during the Atlantic crossing aboard the Liberty ship SS William Patterson. The vessel itself represented American industrial capacity that defied German comprehension. Built in 67 days at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, it was one of 2,710 such vessels that would be completed during the war. The German prisoners traveled in converted cargo holds with bunks, ventilation, and sanitary facilities that exceeded the accommodations provided to German troops on most troop transports. The food during the crossing had been the first crack in Nazi ideology. 3 meals daily, with portions that exceeded what Luftwaffe personnel received at well-supplied bases. Fresh bread, real coffee, meat, vegetables, and dairy products in quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Gefreit Anna Müller, a 22-year-old radar operator from Berlin whose father worked in aircraft production, had written in her hidden diary, "The Americans feed prisoners better than we feed our own soldiers. Either this is an elaborate deception, or everything we were told about American resource shortages was a lie." The crossing had taken 11 days, during which the prisoners observed American naval efficiency that contradicted 3 years of propaganda about democratic military weakness. The ship's crew operated with casual professionalism, maintaining complex equipment, navigating using radar and radio systems, managing supply logistics for both crew and prisoners without apparent strain. Most disturbing to German preconceptions was the crew's youth and informality. Sailors barely out of their teens operated sophisticated equipment while joking, smoking, and discussing post-war plans as if military victory was simply a matter of time. Upon arrival at Norfolk Naval Base, the prisoners witnessed American port operations that dwarfed anything they had seen in Hamburg or Bremen. Dozens of ships loading and unloading simultaneously, cranes moving with electric precision, warehouses stretching beyond the horizon, filled with supplies bound for European and Pacific theaters. The scale suggested industrial capacity that made German war production appear primitive by comparison. The train journey from Norfolk to Louisiana provided the next phase of ideological demolition. Rather than cattle cars or freight wagons, the prisoners traveled in standard passenger coaches with padded seats, climate control, and dining car service. The route took them through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Mississippi, providing a comprehensive view of American domestic infrastructure during wartime. Through the windows, they observed electric lighting in every town, regardless of size. Rural areas displayed the same illumination that in Germany was available only in major cities before the war. Every farmhouse blazed with light, every street corner was illuminated, every shop window glowed with electric signs. The contrast with Germany's blackout regulations, in effect since September 1939, was psychologically devastating. Unteroffizier Greta Schneider, a communications supervisor from Munich whose husband served in the SS, had initially dismissed the displays as propaganda staged for prisoner observation. But the casual nature of the abundance suggested otherwise. American families were visible through house windows, eating dinner under electric light, listening to radios, living normal lives while their nation fought wars on 2 continents. The industrial facilities visible from the train defied comprehension. In Tennessee, they passed aluminum plants consuming more electricity than entire German cities. In Mississippi, aircraft assembly facilities that produced more planes monthly than German factories managed annually. Oil refineries processing petroleum in quantities that Germany had never possessed, even at the height of its European conquests. Camp Rustin itself shattered the final remnants of Nazi propaganda about American prison camp conditions. The facility sprawled across 400 acres of pine forest, with wooden barracks that exceeded the construction quality of most German military installations. Each building was electrified, heated, and equipped with modern plumbing. The camp had been constructed in 87 days by civilian contractors working around the clock, using more lumber than entire German cities possessed after 3 years of wartime rationing. The first sight that challenged their expectations was the American guards themselves. Not the brutal overseers of Nazi imagination, but young men who helped the women down from the trucks with obvious courtesy. Sergeant James Murphy, a 20-year-old farm boy from Iowa, had learned basic German phrases specifically for prisoner interaction. His greeting, delivered in accented but grammatically correct German, expressed hope that their journey had been comfortable and assured them that their accommodations would meet their needs. The camp commander, Captain Sarah Mitchell, addressed the new arrivals in fluent German acquired during her undergraduate studies at Wellesley College. She explained camp regulations, work assignments, recreational opportunities, and educational programs available to prisoners who demonstrated cooperative attitudes. The concept of recreational opportunities for enemy prisoners was alien to women conditioned by Nazi ideology, where imprisonment meant punishment, degradation, and frequently death. The barracks interior exceeded the living conditions most had known as civilians in wartime Germany. Individual beds with clean mattresses, electric heating systems, private bathroom facilities with hot running water, and storage space for personal belongings. Windows provided natural light supplemented by electric fixtures. The construction quality, using materials and methods unavailable in Germany since 1941, demonstrated American resource abundance on a scale that made Nazi promises of post-war prosperity appear absurd. But the most profound shock came during their first meal in the camp mess hall. The evening menu included roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread with butter, milk, and apple pie. Portions were generous enough to satisfy hunger completely, with seconds available for those who requested them. The kitchen staff, observing some prisoners' hesitation to take adequate food, encouraged them to eat their fill. Oberstfried Hoffman watched in disbelief as kitchen workers scraped leftover food into waste containers. In Germany, such food would have fed entire families for days. Here, it was discarded without thought because preparing excess was standard procedure to ensure adequate nutrition for all prisoners. The waste represented abundance beyond German comprehension, a nation so secure in its production capacity that feeding enemies generously posed no resource strain. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating to Nazi ideology. Women who had been taught that America was a weak, decadent nation on the verge of collapse discovered a society operating at levels of efficiency and abundance that exceeded anything they had experienced in the Reich at its peak. The cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality created the first cracks in ideological conditioning that would eventually lead to complete transformation. September 3, 1944. The oppressive heat of late summer Louisiana settled over Camp Rustin like a suffocating blanket, with temperatures reaching 97 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity levels that made every movement an effort. The German women prisoners had spent 3 weeks adapting to their new reality, a process that continued to challenge every assumption they had carried about American military character and capabilities. The daily routine established by Captain Mitchell combined work assignments, educational opportunities, and recreational periods in a schedule that prioritized prisoner health and morale. Morning work details included laundry operations, kitchen assistance, camp maintenance, and clerical tasks that utilized their technical skills. These assignments were rotated weekly to prevent monotony and ensure all prisoners learned various aspects of camp operations. The educational programs represented the most radical departure from German military thinking. English language classes were conducted by Lieutenant Margaret Davis, a former high school teacher from Vermont who volunteered for prisoner education duty. The classes were optional, but attendance was nearly universal as prisoners recognized the practical value of English proficiency. More surprisingly, the curriculum included American history, civics, and literature, subjects that German authorities would never have taught to enemy prisoners. Oberstfried Hoffmann found herself particularly drawn to these classes, where Lieutenant Davis presented American democracy not as propaganda, but as a system of government with both strengths and acknowledged flaws. The willingness to discuss American shortcomings, including racial segregation and economic inequality, paradoxically strengthened the credibility of democratic ideals by demonstrating intellectual honesty impossible under Nazi ideology. The transformation in the prisoner's physical condition was becoming increasingly apparent. Faces that had been gaunt from wartime rationing began to fill out. The gray pallor of exhaustion and malnutrition gave way to healthier complexions. Energy levels increased as their bodies adapted to adequate nutrition and the absence of the constant stress that had characterized life in wartime Germany. But it was the heat that created the conditions for the next phase of their ideological transformation. The medical officer, Lieutenant Dr. Helen Rogers, had documented increasing cases of heat exhaustion among prisoners whose European physiology was poorly adapted to Louisiana's subtropical climate. The camp's medical facilities were excellent by any standard, better equipped than most German civilian hospitals, but prevention was preferable to treatment. Dr. Rogers, a 1942 graduate of Johns Hopkins Medical School who had requested assignment to prisoner medical care, consulted with Captain Mitchell about measures to protect prisoner health during the extended heat wave forecast for early September. The discussion took place in the captain's office, a wooden structure cooled by electric fans that consumed more electricity in a single day than most German homes used in a month. The solution they devised would have been unthinkable in any German military context. The Washita River, flowing clear and deep through the pine forests a mile from camp, offered natural cooling that could prevent heat-related medical emergencies. Recreational swimming, supervised by guards trained in water safety, would provide both physical relief and psychological benefits that might accelerate the democratic re-education process. Captain Mitchell's announcement during the afternoon assembly created a silence so profound that the humming of electric fans became audible throughout the recreation hall. The 47 prisoners sat in neat rows, their faces displaying confusion, suspicion, and in some cases, barely concealed hope. The concept of recreational activities for enemy prisoners challenged every assumption about military imprisonment that Nazi ideology had instilled. The weather forecast calls for temperatures exceeding 95 degrees for the remainder of the week, Captain Mitchell announced in careful German, her pronunciation reflecting academic training rather than native fluency, but demonstrating respect for the prisoner's language. The medical officer has recommended recreational swimming to prevent heat exhaustion and maintain prisoner health. The Washita River runs clean and deep approximately 1 mile from camp. Guards will escort any prisoners who wish to participate. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Gefreit Mueller raised her hand tentatively. Captain, you are proposing that we swim in the river for pleasure? The German word she used, Vergnügen, carried connotations of frivolous enjoyment that seemed impossible to reconcile with military imprisonment. Captain Mitchell's smile was genuine, an expression that these women had rarely encountered from authority figures in Nazi Germany, where smiles from superiors typically preceded punishment or indicated sadistic pleasure. Yes, Gefreit. The water temperature is approximately 75 degrees, ideal for swimming. The location has been scouted for safety and security. You would swim under guard supervision, but the purpose is entirely recreational. Oberstfried Hoffmann later described her thought process during this moment. Everything in my experience said this was impossible. Prisoners were not taken swimming for pleasure. Guards did not concern themselves with prisoner comfort beyond minimum survival requirements. Yet here was an American officer proposing exactly what German military doctrine said could never happen. The questions that followed revealed the depth of Nazi conditioning about enemy treatment. Unteroffizier Schneider, whose husband served in an SS unit and who had been the most resistant to American re-education efforts, asked whether the swimming would be photographed for propaganda purposes. The question reflected German military practice, where prisoner activities were often staged for publicity. Captain Mitchell's response was direct and honest. There will be no photography without your explicit consent. This is a medical and morale measure, not a publicity opportunity. Your participation is entirely voluntary, and those who prefer not to swim may remain in camp with normal recreational activities. The transparency was revolutionary to women conditioned by a system where authorities never explained their motivations and where questioning orders was treason. Lieutenant Davis, who had been observing the session, added that prisoners could inspect the swimming location before making their decision, another example of the respect for individual choice that characterized American military practice. The discussion that followed among the prisoners revealed the psychological complexity of their situation. Many had begun to question Nazi propaganda about American character, but accepting recreational privileges from enemies challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, national loyalty, and military honor. The internal conflict was visible in their expressions and body language. Gefreit Müller expressed the dilemma that many faced. If we accept this kindness, are we betraying Germany? If we refuse, are we harming ourselves for no purpose? In Germany, we were taught that accepting anything from enemies was collaboration, but we were also taught that Americans would never offer such things. Dr. Rogers addressed the medical aspects in terms that emphasized individual health rather than political considerations. Heat exhaustion could lead to serious complications, particularly for women whose nutritional status had been compromised by wartime rationing. Swimming provided cardiovascular exercise, stress relief, and natural cooling that air circulation fans could not match. The democratic process that followed would have been impossible in any German military context. Captain Mitchell allowed the prisoners to discuss the proposal among themselves, to ask questions, and to make individual decisions without pressure or coercion. No orders were given, no threats implied, no consequences suggested for those who chose not to participate. By evening, 23 of the 47 prisoners had signed up for the first swimming expedition. The list included surprising names, women who had maintained Nazi loyalty longer than others, alongside those who had been quickest to adapt to American treatment. The diversity suggested that curiosity about American intentions was overcoming ideological resistance. Those who declined offered various reasons. Some cited religious modesty concerns about mixed swimming with male guards present. Others, led by Unteroffizier Schneider, maintained that accepting recreational privileges from enemies was inappropriate for German military personnel. A few simply feared that the offer concealed some form of trap or punishment. The evening before the first swimming expedition, the camp was alive with unusual energy. Prisoners who had signed up spent time discussing what to expect, sharing fears and hopes in conversations that would have been reported to authorities as defeatist in Nazi Germany. The freedom to express uncertainty, to admit fear, to hope for pleasure was itself a form of liberation from totalitarian conditioning. Obergefreit Hoffmann wrote in her diary that night, "Tomorrow we will swim in an American river, guarded by American soldiers who claim to want only our comfort and health. If this is propaganda, it is the most elaborate deception in history. If it is genuine, then everything we believed about enemies and warfare was wrong. Either way, tomorrow will change us forever." The evening air carried the sound of the river flowing through the forest, a constant murmur that had become the soundtrack to their captivity. For 23 German women, that sound now represented possibility rather than imprisonment, hope rather than despair, and the promise that even in wartime, humanity could survive between enemies. September 5, 1944. The convoy of 3 military trucks departed Camp Ruston at 2 p.m. sharp, carrying 23 German prisoners, 8 American guards, Captain Mitchell, and Dr. Rogers toward the Washita River through the dappled shade of Louisiana pine forests. The afternoon heat had reached 96 degrees, making the canvas truck covers feel like ovens despite the movement of air through open flaps. The prisoners wore an assortment of makeshift swimming attire assembled by the camp's seamstresses from available materials. Standard issue undergarments had been modified with additional coverage. Camp uniforms had been altered for water use, and some women wore combinations of clothing that would function adequately for swimming while maintaining the modesty standards of 1940s society. The improvised nature of their swimwear reflected the unprecedented character of the expedition. Sergeant Murphy rode in the lead truck, his easy manner and basic German vocabulary having made him popular among the prisoners during their 3 weeks at camp. At 20, he possessed the unconscious confidence of rural American youth, raised on an Iowa farm where problem-solving and practical cooperation were daily requirements. His casual competence in handling military responsibilities while maintaining genuine friendliness challenged German preconceptions about American military discipline. The forest road wound through pine stands that had been selectively logged to supply lumber for camp construction, leaving a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the harsh sunlight into manageable patterns. The prisoners pressed against the truck sides, observing the natural abundance of American forests. In Germany, such timber resources had been exhausted by wartime demands, leaving landscapes scarred by desperate logging operations. The sound of flowing water became audible before the river came into view, a constant murmur that suggested substantial volume and steady current. When the trucks emerged from the forest into a natural clearing beside the Washita, the sight exceeded every expectation the prisoners had formed during the mile-long journey. The river curved through the landscape like a brown ribbon, its waters stained by tannic acid from upstream vegetation, but clean and clear enough to reveal sandy bottom and submerged logs. The swimming area had been selected by advanced reconnaissance for its safety features: a gentle slope into water that deepened gradually to about 8 feet at the center, clear sight lines for security observation, and sufficient current to maintain water quality without creating dangerous conditions. What followed next would be recorded in dozens of personal accounts as the moment when the final barriers between captors and prisoners dissolved in the face of shared human experience. As the trucks stopped and prisoners climbed down, they expected to be marched to the water under heavy guard, perhaps allowed to wade briefly under strict supervision before being returned to camp. Instead, Sergeant Murphy sat down on a fallen log and began unlacing his combat boots. "Water looks perfect today," he announced to the other guards in English, then repeated the sentiment in broken German for the prisoners' benefit. "Temperatures just right for swimming." The German women watched in mounting amazement as American guards began stripping down to swimming attire that had been prepared specifically for this expedition. Not maintaining security positions with weapons ready, not preserving the rigid distance between guards and prisoners that military doctrine required, but preparing to enter the water alongside their charges. Gefreit Müller later wrote, "The concept was so alien to German military thinking that several of us initially refused to believe what we were seeing. Guards swimming with prisoners suggested a level of trust and humanity that had been systematically eliminated from German military culture. We had been taught that maintaining absolute separation between captors and prisoners was essential for security and discipline." Dr. Rogers had positioned herself with a clear view of the entire swimming area, her medical bag within easy reach and emergency protocols prepared, but her presence was reassuring rather than intimidating. At 26, she represented the new generation of American women whose education and professional competence challenged Nazi theories about female capabilities and social roles. Captain Mitchell was the first person into the water, removing her outer clothing to reveal a one-piece swimming suit that met contemporary modesty standards while allowing freedom of movement. Her dive from the fallen log was clean and confident, and she surfaced with genuine laughter that echoed across the river. "Come on in," she called in German, her accent carrying the enthusiasm of someone sharing a pleasure rather than issuing a military command. The transformation that followed was gradual but unmistakable. Tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, the German prisoners entered the river. The initial shock of cool water against heat-stressed bodies was followed by relief so profound that several women gasped with pleasure. For many, this was their first experience with natural swimming water, having grown up in industrial areas where rivers were polluted and recreational swimming was a luxury beyond working-class means. Obertfried Hoffmann, who had grown up in Hamburg's industrial slums where the nearest clean water was the Elbe River's shipping channels, found herself learning to float under Sergeant Murphy's patient instruction. He supported my back gently while I learned to trust the water's buoyancy, she wrote in her diary that evening. This enemy soldier was teaching me something beautiful, something my own nation had never offered its citizens. The guards' behavior continued to challenge every assumption about military imprisonment that Nazi ideology had instilled. Rather than maintaining formation or preserving authoritarian distance, they engaged in water fights, taught swimming strokes to prisoners who had never learned, and participated in games that emerged spontaneously from the group dynamic. Corporal Williams, a 19-year-old from Texas whose cheerful competence had made her invaluable for prisoner relations, found herself teaching the backstroke to Unteroffizier Schneider, the SS wife who had been most resistant to American re-education efforts. The irony was not lost on either woman. A young American teaching advanced swimming techniques to a German whose husband served in units responsible for war crimes. The psychological transformation was visible and immediate. Women who had maintained rigid military bearing since their capture began laughing spontaneously. Faces that had been set in expressions of suspicion and defiance relaxed into genuine smiles. Voices that had been carefully modulated to avoid showing emotion became animated with excitement and pleasure. Dr. Rogers documented the change in her medical notes. The prisoner's demeanor altered completely within the first hour of water activity. Muscle tension decreased noticeably, facial expressions softened, and vocal patterns shifted from the clipped, guarded speech characteristic of military prisoners to the natural rhythms of people enjoying shared recreation. The most profound change occurred in the social dynamics between guards and prisoners. The artificial barriers maintained by military protocol dissolved in an environment where rank and nationality seemed temporarily irrelevant. American soldiers found themselves genuinely concerned for prisoners' swimming safety, while German women offered assistance to guards who were less skilled in the water. By the second hour, the group had organized itself into informal swimming lessons, water games, and relaxation activities that bore no resemblance to military imprisonment. Sergeant Murphy was teaching American folk songs to a group of prisoners floating near the bank. Corporal Williams was learning German phrases from women eager to practice their English. The river had become a space where the war seemed temporarily suspended. The most remarkable transformation occurred in Unteroffizier Schneider, whose initial resistance had gradually given way to curious participation. As she learned to swim with instruction from guards who knew about her husband's SS affiliation, the cognitive dissonance became overwhelming. They knew about my husband's unit, she later wrote. I had told them during interrogation, expecting hatred or retribution. Instead, they expressed hope that all families would be reunited safely after the war. This mercy toward the wife of their enemy was incomprehensible to everything I had been taught about warfare and human nature. The afternoon proceeded without incident, security concerns, or disciplinary problems. The guards maintained awareness of their responsibilities while participating fully in recreational activities. The prisoners demonstrated no inclination toward escape, violence, or uncooperative behavior. The success of the experiment exceeded Captain Mitchell's most optimistic projections. As the shadows lengthened and the time came to return to camp, the group's reluctance to leave the river was universal. Prisoners and guards alike had experienced something unprecedented in their military service, a moment of pure human connection that transcended the artificial divisions of warfare. The truck ride back to camp was filled with animated conversation between former enemies who had discovered their shared humanity in the waters of the Washita River. That evening, the transformation was evident throughout the camp. Prisoners who had participated in the swimming expedition moved with different body language, spoke with different vocal tones, and interacted with guards in ways that reflected the afternoon's breakthrough in human relations. The simple act of swimming together had accomplished what months of re-education programs might have struggled to achieve. The swimming expeditions continued twice weekly through September and October 1944, establishing a rhythm that fundamentally altered the social dynamics of Camp Ruston. Each journey to the Washita River further eroded the ideological barriers that 3 years of Nazi indoctrination had constructed in the prisoners' minds. The casual humanity displayed by American guards, their consistent willingness to treat enemies as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and even friendship, created cognitive dissonance that propaganda could no longer resolve. By the third week of September, the character of the swimming groups had evolved beyond recognition of traditional military prisoner relationships. What had begun as a medical necessity to prevent heat exhaustion had become a laboratory for democratic values, where former enemies discovered their shared humanity through the simple pleasure of cool water on hot days. The friendships that developed between guards and prisoners challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, nationality, and human nature. Sergeant Murphy found himself genuinely concerned about Oberstfried Hoffmann's progress in learning English, bringing her books from the camp library and spending evening hours helping her with pronunciation. His motivation was purely humanitarian, the natural response of a young man raised in Iowa farming culture where helping neighbors was an automatic reflex. Corporal Williams had begun teaching German folk songs to American guards, while learning traditional American ballads from the prisoners. The cultural exchange that emerged from these interactions demonstrated the artificiality of national hatred that Nazi ideology had promoted. Music, it turned out, transcended political boundaries and revealed the universal human appreciation for beauty and artistic expression. The most dramatic transformation occurred in Unteroffizier Schneider, whose husband's SS service had initially made her the most resistant to American re-education efforts. Her participation in swimming expeditions had created internal conflicts that Nazi conditioning could not resolve. The experience of receiving kindness from guards who knew about her husband's affiliation with war crimes units shattered her remaining faith in racial ideology. "They treated me with dignity despite knowing my husband served in the SS," she wrote in a letter discovered decades later in her family's papers. "When I mentioned his unit's location, hoping perhaps for news, they expressed sympathy that I was separated from my family and said they hoped the war would end soon so all families could be reunited safely." This mercy toward the wife of their enemy was incomprehensible to everything I had been taught about American character and military practice. The psychological impact extended far beyond individual friendships to challenge the prisoners' fundamental understanding of democracy, capitalism, and human nature. The guards' behavior suggested that American propaganda about democratic values was not propaganda at all, but accurate description of a society that actually functioned according to principles of human dignity and individual worth. Captain Mitchell documented the program's remarkable success in weekly reports to the War Department. The recreational swimming program has produced unprecedented results in prisoner cooperation and attitude modification. Escape attempts have ceased entirely among participants. Prisoners demonstrate increasing willingness to share intelligence information and express genuine interest in democratic principles and American social institutions. The simple act of treating them as human beings has accomplished more than any traditional interrogation or re-education technique. The success at Camp Ruston led to rapid expansion of recreational programs at other facilities holding female prisoners. By October 1944, swimming expeditions, sports activities, and cultural exchanges had become standard practice at American POW camps, contributing significantly to the broader success of democratic re-education programs that would help rebuild Germany after the war. The program's effectiveness was measured not only in improved prisoner morale, but in concrete intelligence benefits. Women who had operated Luftwaffe radar and communications equipment began volunteering detailed information about German defensive systems, aircraft production capabilities, and military communications procedures. Their cooperation was motivated not by coercion but by gratitude for humane treatment and growing conviction that American victory would benefit both nations. Dr. Rogers documented the medical benefits in reports that would influence post-war psychology. Prisoners participating in swimming programs demonstrated significant improvements in physical health, mental stability, and social adjustment. Rates of depression, anxiety, and psychosomatic illness decreased markedly. Sleep patterns normalized, appetite improved, and overall psychological resilience increased substantially. The educational impact proved equally significant. Prisoners who had initially resisted English language instruction became eager students, recognizing that language skills would be valuable in post-war reconstruction. American history classes, previously viewed with suspicion as propaganda, gained credibility as prisoners observed democratic principles functioning in daily practice rather than mere theory. The most profound changes occurred in the prisoners' understanding of women's roles in society. Observing American women guards, medical officers, and administrative personnel performing professional duties with competence and authority challenged Nazi ideology about female capabilities. Dr. Rogers, in particular, became a role model for women who had been taught that professional careers were incompatible with feminine nature. American women served in positions of real authority and responsibility. Gefreit Mueller wrote in her post-war memoir, "They made decisions, commanded respect, and demonstrated competence that equaled or exceeded their male colleagues. This contradicted everything we had been taught about natural gender roles and female limitations." Watching them work made us realize that Nazi restrictions on women's education and careers had been artificial barriers designed to waste human potential. The approaching end of the war in Europe created complex emotions among the Camp Rustin prisoners. News of German military defeats was received with sadness for their homeland, but without the despair that might have been expected. Their experience of American treatment had convinced them that defeat by the United States meant liberation rather than destruction for the German people. When news of Hitler's suicide reached the camp on May 2, 1945, the prisoners' reaction surprised American authorities. Rather than expressions of grief or defiance, most women expressed relief that the war would soon end and families could be reunited. The psychological distance they had traveled from Nazi ideology was measured in their responses to their leader's death. The final swimming expedition took place on May 15, 1945, 1 week after Germany's surrender. The group included nearly all 47 prisoners, as those who had initially refused participation had gradually joined over the 8 months of the program. The atmosphere was bittersweet, combining celebration of the war's end with sadness about impending separation from friendships that had transcended national boundaries. Oberstfried Hoffmann's final diary entry about the swimming program captured the transformation that had occurred. "We came to America as believers in Nazi superiority and American weakness. We discovered through the simple kindness of swimming expeditions that our captors possessed greater strength than we had imagined. Not the strength of weapons, but the strength of character that treats enemies with dignity and sees shared humanity even in wartime." The repatriation process that began in June 1945 was conducted with the same consideration that had characterized the prisoners' entire American experience. Transportation was arranged on passenger ships with proper accommodations, food supplies were generous, and personal belongings accumulated during captivity were carefully protected. Many prisoners received letters of recommendation from American personnel for use in post-war employment. The women returned to a Germany devastated by bombing, occupation, and social collapse. But they carried with them something precious: knowledge of how a democratic society functioned in practice, evidence that prosperity could be achieved through freedom rather than conquest, and personal relationships with Americans that contradicted racial ideology. Their influence on post-war German reconstruction was substantial but often invisible. Many became teachers, nurses, social workers, and community leaders who quietly promoted democratic values and American-style social institutions. Their children grew up hearing stories of American kindness that shaped attitudes toward the Atlantic Alliance and European integration. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, surviving members of the Camp Rustin swimming group organized a reunion in Louisiana. 18 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing children and grandchildren to show them where their mother's transformation had begun. The Washita River looked unchanged, flowing through the same pine forests where enemy soldiers had become friends. Former Oberstfried Hoffmann, who had become Elizabeth Thompson after marrying an American soldier and immigrating to the United States in 1947, spoke at the reunion dinner. Her remarks captured the essential truth of their experience. "In this river, we learned that humanity could survive even in war, that enemies could become friends through simple acts of kindness, and that the greatest strength is not the power to destroy, but the courage to show mercy. America won our hearts not through force or propaganda, but through the revolutionary act of treating us as human beings worth saving from the heat of a Louisiana summer." The gathering concluded with a return to the river, where elderly women who had once been enemy prisoners swam again in the waters where their transformation had begun. The circle of reconciliation was complete. proving that sometimes the most profound victories in war are won not through conquest, but through the patient work of human kindness that plants seeds of peace in the most unlikely soil.